Being able to distinguish one object from another is vitally important. In fact, one of the most important purposes of vision is to recognize and identify things and people. This object processing ability is surprisingly difficult. The world is made up of a constant stream of light entering the eye, and your brain has to sort through this mass of information, detect edges and patterns, and from that, decide what you see. In this video, we will explore three psychological aspects of recognizing objects and people. That is figure ground segregation, which is when we determine the form of something, your brain has to differentiate it from the background. Recognition happens when whether you know the things you're looking at, that is whether you find it familiar. And face recognition, a special case of object recognition because, well, faces are so special. In the last video, we introduced the concept of simple, complex, and hyper-complex cells. The brain acts as a supercomputer working out what each of these cells say about a scene in front of you and whether an object is present. But even with many millions of hyper-complex cells, the fact that the brain can work out every single object is unfathomable. A useful analogy of the steps involved in seeing form is that of cooking. At the end of hours of cooking, you have a lovely meal made up of many separate elements. Hundreds of processes are involved in turning the raw ingredient into the meal. And likewise, to see an object, hundreds of processes turn the many edges you see into an object. Now, we explore two key theories of how people group the basic building blocks so that they can see what's one object, what's a different object, and what's in the background, or spatial frequency and Gestalt principles. Spatial frequency is basically a measure of how much fine detail something has. It's typically assessed using gratings or black and white bars we have seen in the past videos. Now, wider gratings mean lower spatial frequency. Spatial frequency therefore refers to the rate of change in a pattern over a particular space. Now, the whole world can be broken down into different spatial frequency information. If you look at a pretty meadow, you're looking at mostly low spatial frequencies. When looking at the grasses in the meadow, you're looking at higher spatial frequencies. If you look at the world and find one area with one spatial frequency and another area with a different spatial frequency, you can establish that they are different objects. So, with this figure right here, you see the inner circle as a different object than the outer circle because they are of different spatial frequency. So, spatial frequency is a useful tool for detecting objects. But although people can see a wide range of spatial frequencies, some are too high or too low for them to detect. When the spatial frequency is too high, you don't see black and white lines, but instead a uniform gray color. The ability to perceive high spatial frequencies deteriorate with age, and as you get older, you can see less high spatial frequencies and less fine details. Light is also important. You need more light to see the higher spatial frequencies, which is why reading in the dark is harder. Now, recent experience also affects spatial frequency detection. Exposure can cause spatial frequency adaptation, as we have discussed in the past video, and reading for a prolonged period causes adaptation to high spatial frequencies, and so can make seeing them after reading harder. That's why you should always take a break and go outdoors after studying to correct the after effects, something that we have covered in the past videos. So, Finally, the context can affect how you see spatial frequencies. Again, in this figure, notice how the different center gratings appear to be slanted to the right, whereas actually they are vertical. This effect is called the tilt illusion. Context makes the grating look slanted. In the early 1900s, German psychologists Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Kohler, and Kurt Koffka proposed an alternative to the spatial frequency idea that we have discussed earlier. Now, this school of thought is called Gestaltism, read as Gestaltism in the American pronunciation and Gestaltism in the British pronunciation. Now, it's an approach to perception in which things are grouped together. The word Gestalt has entered modern speech to mean the whole. Now, so the question here is what did you see first in the image, the big letter G or the smaller letter S's? A clear indication of how people perceive the whole comes from using hierarchical stimuli, which are a whole stimulus made up of smaller elements such as a Navon letter right here, a big global letter made up of smaller local ones. Generally, people find it easier and quicker to identify the big letter than the smaller letter. This is called the global superiority effect. Now, some groups of people seem to see hierarchical stimuli differently to others. People with Williams syndrome are much less able to see the local letters when asked to copy the letter. They only draw the letter G. People with autism show the opposite pattern and have difficulty seeing the large letter. When asked to copy the letter, they may only draw lots of letter S's in a random pattern. So, the global superiority effect shows that people naturally group things together. Gestaltists went about trying to identify what features dictated what would be grouped together. They came up with a set of principles or laws that people used to group the world together. The main law was that people group features according to the simplest pattern possible. This is called the law of pregnance. Some people even experience humor when the law of pregnance messes with their minds. We can see in this picture of a very handsome llama, which is compared to a similar looking Taylor Lautner. The second law of Gestalt is the law of proximity, which states that elements that are near to each other tend to be perceived as a single unit. In this example, instead of reading no parking falling coconut, most people will read this as no falling parking coconut, because the words no and falling are near to each other while the words parking and coconut are near to one another. Now, the law of similarity claims that elements that appear similar are perceived as one unit. So elements that have, for example, the same color, shape, or other common characteristics are perceived to be belonging together. This is why finding Melissa amongst the Maltesers is not that easy. So, the next is the law of closure, which explains why elements are recognized even if they are incomplete or non-existent. This is due to our previous experiences and prior knowledge about possible shapes, figures, and even words. Thus, mentally, we can supplement missing parts of an element. And then we have the law of good continuity, and it posits that the human eyes can easily and naturally follow elements that are arranged along a continuous line. Those elements are therefore perceived as a unit. Further, elements that follow each other either logically or temporal are perceived as one unit as well. And then we have the law of symmetry, which comprise the fact that we prefer symmetric appearances over asymmetric ones. Symmetric objects or arrangements are associated with positive aspects such as stability, consistency, and structure. Asymmetric arrangements, on the other hand, give a rather negative impression, like something is wrong, missing, or out of balance, similar to what we see in this picture. And then, another Gestalt law that can be quite useful is the law of experience. It explains that we can expect others to use their prior knowledge in order to understand certain elements. A common example is related to grammar and spelling. For example, sometimes we overlook a spelling mistake because we have memorized a word as a whole and do not look at every letter within the word specifically. This can also happen in sentences. If you have not seen it yet, the word off was repeated in the sentence that the car worthy of your attention. So you don't have to find the missing typo here anymore. Now, brain imaging studies show that your brain uses specific parts of the brain for each of the Gestalt principles. It combines these features together but make use of uniform connectedness more readily than other features. However, one main issue with much of the Gestaltist works is that they used abstract patterns rather than anything in the real world. So their works lack what we call as ecological validity. It may apply to the real world, however, if we will just look hard enough. So, are you looking at an image of Wolverine or two Batmen looking at each other? We can spend a healthy amount of time debating, but what is happening here is that the visual system breaks down what you're looking at into constituent parts and then group them back together. When this process is finished, higher level parts of your brain can determine what the object is that you are looking at. Recognition is subtly different from identification. The latter means that in addition to finding an object familiar, you have to be able to name it. So, in this section of the video, we will consider the three main approaches to object perception and recognition. This is using shapes, using sketches, and views. So, American vision scientist Irving Biederman thought that when people see objects, or when people see an object, they try to work out the components that make it up, not in the same way as working out the simple edges that comprise a shape though. He thought that every object people see in the world can be broken down into a few key three-dimensional forms called geons. Geons are basic shapes that comprise every object, such as cubes, spheres, cylinders, cones, and pyramids. Some art classes teach people to paint by breaking what they see into these simple shapes. To construct a cup, for example, you need a cylinder with a curved cylinder attached to the handle. According to this theory, there are only 36 geons that exist, and they are sufficient to make all objects possible. When you see a new object, the idea is that you establish what geons are required to make it up and compare these groups of geons to your stored knowledge about the geons needed to construct objects. This theory solves one of the major problems in object perception. People find recognizing objects easy even without being able to see the whole object and from different viewing angles. This ability is actually remarkable because objects can look very different from different views. In Biederman's approach, people can easily distinguish geons from many different angles, so also So also recognize an object made up of geons at different angles. Now, evidence also exists that the human brain has cells that respond only to these simple geons. The monkey inferotemporal cortex, which is part of the brain just below the temples, contains cells that respond to cylinders and nothing else, for example. Biederman also provided a theory for what information is needed to construct a geon. His ideas are clearly based on Gestalt approach. Although Biederman's theory had been or has been highly influential, many people have difficulty accepting that every object can be broken down into the same geons. Consider, for example, a cup and a bucket. They're made up of the same geons, just arranged slightly different. The theory suggests that people should quite easily confuse them, but in practice, we don't confuse cups to buckets. Now, David Marr, a British neuroscientist, suggested that images are subject to different computational processes, creating a series of sequential representations. Now, the first is that the brain forms a primal sketch. This two-dimensional line drawing provides information about edges, contours, and blobs. Then the brain creates a 2.5D sketch. This image includes information regarding shading, texture, motion, and depth cues. This sketch and the primary sketch produce images linked to one viewpoint. The brain then produces a 3D model. With this representation, people can view objects from many different angles to recognize them. This model seems to be based on physiological information produced by the visual areas of the brain involved in the first stage of processing. In this case, the primary visual cortex produces information about edges and can be used to form the primal sketch. Later areas in the brain produces information regarding color, texture, and so on. Further on in the brain, the inferotemporal cortex seems to combine all these sources of information together. Now, the exemplar model of recognition suggests that people store multiple representations of objects. Every time you see, for example, a dog, you store an image of this. Three-dimensional viewing is established by combining multiple views of the same object. This recognition process is relatively simple. When you see an object, the brain produces a particular pattern of neural responses, a certain set of cells that are activated. Now, this pattern of activation is stored and remembered. If you see something similar, the brain activates a similar pattern of cells. Depending on the similarity, you recognize the object or not. Now, a crucial aspect of this model is that the patterns of activation for the stored objects and the newly seen one don't have to match exactly to give a recognition response. Like when you have a pattern for a dog because you have previously seen a beagle, but now in front of you is a pug. Now, this is especially important because sometimes parts of an object is hidden too. Now, most objects have a natural agreed upon viewpoint. For example, no one considers that looking down at the top of a car is a standard view, but a near front-on view probably is. If you ask people to name objects as quickly as possible, they're faster if the object is presented in a standard view than when it's viewed from a different viewpoint. Now, the brain accesses the standard viewpoint more readily than other viewpoints. Research also shows that when people learn about objects, they learn not only the way they look, but also the way they move. In other words, people attach motion to a stored image of a certain object. This means that the standard view of a certain animal may include an element of motion. That is why you can, even if you're not looking at a dog in front of you, you can imagine how a particular dog or how dogs move all together. Now, let's move on to faces. Faces are the single most important visual stimulus in the human environment. It's one of the few undeniable fact of psychology. In your lifetime, you can recognize between 10,000 to 20,000 faces. You can easily discriminate between all faces except identical twins and recognize people, even if you haven't seen them in over 40 years. This ability is actually remarkable because all faces share some basic patterns: two eyes, side by side and over the nose and mouths. Now, people must look at subtle and small information to tell faces apart. And probably you have noticed this, that you can detect people even if they're wearing that surgical mask that we are all wearing right now. Well, not right now, but during the time of the pandemic. Now, when you see a face, you are bombarded with loads of information. A face can tell you someone's characteristics, including age, gender, ethnicity, emotional state, health status, name, and even occupation if you know them. Now, this even includes intentions as well as where these persons are looking. So some people can even tell what others are saying from the way their lips move. A face is the most important visual stimulus to newborn infants and the first thing that they see for a prolonged period. In the United Kingdom, standard practice is to ensure that the mother nurses her baby as soon after birth as possible and for the first few hours so the baby sees the face up close. Given their importance, a huge amount of research has tied to understand how people processes face. With much establishing the face recognition is special in some way. Now, this section of the lesson explores the evidence by looking at research conducted on infant psychological studies and some neuroscientific studies. So I will also describe the basic processes involved in face recognition and relate them to the models of object recognition in the earlier section of this video. Now, to establish whether face recognition is special, we need to define the term. Specialness in the psychological sense means that the processing of face is unique, different to that of object, and uses a special part of the brain. Face processing may also be innate. Now, the research that we will discuss in this section of the video highlights that face recognition is very special indeed. People seem to show an early preference for faces. Inverting faces makes them harder to be recognized, and certain brain structures are devoted to face processing, and certain disorders can affect face processing but not anything else. So in this video we will be talking about researches that don't explain why face recognition is different from object processing. Some psychologists believe that face recognition is innate, but no conclusive evidence exists for this idea. The best evidence suggests that because people encounter so many faces, they must learn to distinguish between them. To achieve this difficult task, people become experts at it, which mean that parts of the human brain becomes devoted to it. If this part gets damaged, people can lose this ability. So, newborn infants by their very nature have very limited abilities apart from being experts in crying. This makes them difficult research participants. They can't respond by pressing buttons in a cognitive psychological experiment. So experimenters have to devise clever experiments to find out what the newborns can see. Robert Fantz, an American developmental psychologist, conducted a number of elaborate studies investigating what infants can see. He developed the visual preference paradigm in 1958, in which he placed infants in a viewing chamber. They sat in front of two patterns in an otherwise plain room, and the experimenters simply recorded which pattern the infant looked at more. If the infant looked at both patterns equally, he assumed that the infant couldn't tell the two patterns apart. Fantz did many such experiments and found that infants preferred to look at a pattern than plain screens. They prefer patterns with curvature, patterns with higher contrast, especially in the top half of the image, patterns with more features, and patterns of a larger size. Interestingly, infants prefer to look at patterns with features arranged to look like a face compared with patterns arranged differently. This discovery was followed up by Caroline Goren, an American pediatric researcher who tested newborn infants at around 9 minutes of age. The researchers showed the infants' schematic drawings of faces, as well as drawings with the features of a face arranged randomly or vertically down the middle of the face, such as what you are seeing right now in the screen. They slowly moved the different faces and measured how much the infant followed them. Now, the infants followed the face stimulus more than other stimuli, even though they were all made up of the same features and so had the same level of complexity. The researchers believed that this finding suggests that face preference is innate because the children were far too young to have experienced the faces, being 9 minutes old. But other explanation also exists. Newborn infants have seen blood vessels while in the womb, which leads them to be better at seeing vertical stripe patterns and make horizontal eye movements. But both actually help them to see faces. Moreover, behavioral evidence suggests that face recognition is different to object recognition in adults. Robert Yin, an American psychologist, conducted an elegant study that changed research in face recognition more than any other. He gave participants a series of faces to learn and then tested the recognition of those faces. The crucial manipulation he made was that some of the faces were upright and some were upside down. So Yin found that people are very good at recognizing upright faces but very bad at recognizing inverted faces. People aren't as good at recognizing other kinds of objects, such as houses and airplanes, as faces, but turning them upside down doesn't make people much worse at recognition. Now, the effect of inversion is therefore selective to faces. This face inversion effect provides clear evidence that people process faces differently to objects, in fact, in a very special way. Perhaps, however, this ability is because people see more faces than any other objects instead of any innate or unique brain process. So, to examine this idea, researchers tested the face inversion effect in children, but as many studies report, children displaying face inversion effect as don't. So a lot of controversy still exists on this point. But what's clear is that children show a smaller face inversion effect than adults, suggesting that the ability is a result of experience. Another way to check whether the face inversion effect is due to experience or a special innate mechanism is to look at what happens when you invert other objects that people are expected to recognize. Unfortunately, no such stimulus exists for most people. Can you think of another object that you've seen more than faces? Actually, I can't think of any. So overall, evidence suggests that people process faces in a special way. But this ability results from years of experiencing processing upright faces. So, one approach to cognitive psychology is to look at people who have problems with a particular ability but not others, called dissociation. If face recognition is special, some people shouldn't be able to do it, and indeed, that's the case. People suffering from the clinical disorder prosopagnosia have an inability to recognize faces and yet can recognize all other objects perfectly fine. The condition often occurs because of a brain injury. Patients with prosopagnosia usually have damage to the occipital lobe and in particular the fusiform gyrus. When presented with faces of familiar people, they don't recognize them. They also can't learn new faces. Cases even exist of farmers with prosopagnosia for their cows, but who can recognize people properly. So, people with this disorder often wake up in hospital with a loved one nearby but can't recognize the person. Although unfortunately no cure exists for prosopagnosia, sufferers can devise compensation strategies. For instance, one person with prosopagnosia that was noted in research always ask what clothes someone will be wearing and then can look out out for that person. People with a related disorder, Capgras delusion, can recognize a face and yet believe that it's not the person they're seeing. For example, you may look at your mother but believe that she's a robot impostor. Eminent British psychologist Hayden Ellis and colleagues compared Capgras and prosopagnosia. They found that when people see faces, they consciously recognize them and their skin increase in conductivity. This is called the skin galvanic response, a response used in TV programmers as a lie detector test, but it doesn't actually work like that in reality. So the idea is that when you see someone familiar, your brain gives you a sense of familiarity and their identity. When patients with prosopagnosia see a face, they don't have the conscious recollection of the face but do have the skin conductance response. When people with Capgras delusion see faces, they don't get the skin conductance response but do consciously recognize the face. Their brains are getting conflicting messages. The first is, I don't know this person, and the second is, they look like X or they look like this person. The only logical explanation, therefore, in the eyes of the patients, is to make that this person is an imposter. Now, this discovery is important because many people with Capgras delusion used to be wrongly diagnosed with schizophrenia. In fact, their delusion makes sense given the disconnected messages of the brain. Now, in the preceding parts of this video, we discussed how that face recognition appears to be different to object recognition. And so psychologists need a new set of models to account for it. They can't just use the models of object recognition as we have discussed earlier. Here, we are going to look at the three most influential theories in face processing: face space, configural processing, and the interactive activation and competition models. So Tim Valentine, a British psychologist with a marvelous mustache, devised face space. He thought that the best way to describe how people recognize faces was to plot it on a graph. Technically, this graph is called a multi-dimensional space, but I draw only two dimensions here, or what we call axes. So each dimension of the space represents a facial feature that people use to recognize faces. Valentine hasn't specified exactly what features are used in these processes, but eye tracking evidence suggests at least one dimension for eyes. Estimations suggest that between 14 and 100 dimensions features are used to recognize faces. The most average face would exist in the center. Every face is coded on its value relative to its average this average face rather. So a face with huge eyes is stored at the opposite end of the space from which with tiny eyes. Now both faces are far from the center and considered distinctive. Recognition is done by matching the face currently being looked at with faces stored in this space. The two faces are recognized if they share enough of the features and can be confused when they're very close to each other in this space, which is why people don't confuse two distinctive faces. This beautifully simple and highly influential model explains a lot of the data from face recognition experiments. For example, average faces are categorized as faces much faster than distinctive faces because they look more like an average face. Distinctive faces are recognized faster than average faces because no other faces are nearby in the space to confuse you. So, one of the models of object recognition suggests that people break the world up into separate features in order to recognize them. Applied to face perception, the model should show that faces are processed by combining a series of spheres, a cone, and some cylinders. But the evidence is extremely clear. People don't process faces by breaking them down. Here, we will talk about how psychologists know that. And I want you to look at this image of the handsome Robert Downey Jr. Do you find anything wrong with it? So, how about now? Now, this is called the Thatcher illusion. So, it's a phenomenon where it becomes more difficult to detect local feature changes in an upside-down face, despite identical changes being obvious in the upright face. So, seeing the grotesque of the face is harder when it's upside down, because you process upside-down faces by breaking it into its constituent parts, and none of them are odd. When the face is the right way up, however, you don't process the face by breaking it up. Instead, you look at the whole. So, here's another demonstration. You know a SPART and known as parts and wholes test. So, if you try to learn the names of the faces presented at the top and then ask to identify which nose belongs to one of these faces, let's say Tom, doing so is easier when it's in the context of the face. Therefore, again, people don't learn face parts in isolation. So, if you still don't believe me, I want you to try this example. This shows this example is called the composite face effect, devised by Andy Young, a British neuroscientist, and his team in 1987. Now, the composite face effect shows up when two faces are split horizontally and stuck together. It's easier to identify the top half when it's misaligned with the bottom one than when the two halves are fitted smoothly together. So, most people will find this task quite challenging. But if we separate out the two faces slightly, it becomes much easier. This effect occurs because people tend to process faces as a whole stimulus rather than the sum of its parts. So put together, the face fuses to form a new identity, and your brain struggle to separate the forms. This phenomenon is called configural or holistic processing. The human brain seems to code the whole face in one lump instead of engaging in featural processing, wherein it would break it down. It would break up the faces or the face. So, when presented with an inverted face, people engage in featural processing. Indeed, Bruno Rochon, a neuroscientist from Belgium, suggested that face processing is due to expertise at configural processing. When people are experts at processing faces, they look at the center of the face and can take in all the information simultaneously. But people who aren't experts need to look at each individual feature in turn. Therefore, people with prosopagnosia and children look at all features equally in a similar way than adults look at inverted faces. So, the two models of face recognition we have discussed earlier, which is face, space, and configural processing, are notable. But they deal primarily with how people perceive faces. But faces give lots of information, not just about identity. To understand how these abilities interact, we turn to Vicky Bruce and Andy Young's model of face processing, what is called the structural model of recognition. This model suggests that separate components exist for 8 different things, and these includes structural encoding, which is a simple description of a face, and then there is expression and analysis of other people's emotions, and then there is facial speech analysis of lip reading, and then we have direct visual processing, codes only face information, and then we have face recognition units, which represents the structural information of a known face. We also have person identity nodes, which link all information specific to a known individual. And then we have name generation, which stores names separately. Also, we have, or rather lastly, we have cognitive systems, which store other information such as facts about someone elsewhere. Now, the interactive activation and competition model has superseded parts of the structural model. It more accurately represents the interaction between face recognition units and semantic information in the previously mentioned list. This model predicts that people can have deficits in emotion processing but intact face recognition, something that has indeed been observed. So, the model also predicts that name information can prime faces of known people. That is, if you present the name of someone familiar, you become faster at recognizing the person from a picture. Furthermore, this model highlights why you can get feelings of familiarity with faces, but without remembering the names. Your face recognition unit has become active, meaning that you recognize the person, but it hasn't activated the person identity node. This experience is certainly familiar to us and can be very embarrassing at times. Note that you never recall someone's name without recalling the other semantic information. Names are clearly more special. So, the world is made up of a constant stream of light entering the eye, and your brain has to sort through this mass of information, detect edges and patterns, and from this, decide what you are seeing. In this video, we talked about how the human brain isolates form from each other, and then and also the backdrop, recognizes objects as familiar, and identify people from their faces. Again, this has been Dex Kamitan, and thank you for watching.